Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 162, and I'm delighted. And this is a podcast I've been looking forward to as well, because I've welcomed back onto the podcast two former guests. We have got Dan Guzman and Yoeri Pegel. So lads, thank you very much for coming back on.
Thanks for having me on, Ben.
Thanks a lot.
We've got a fun one tonight. I'm really looking forward to it because I came up with a little idea a while ago about talking about designing a soccer combine, not in the fact that we're actually going to try and get it into clubs, but just because I think it can open up some decent conversation around the way we test, the way we screen, and possibly some alternatives to traditionally what clubs and coaches have done. And there's no better coaches, no better practitioners than these two to discuss it with. So I'm delighted they're on the podcast, and I'm going to get straight into it because I know there's going to be some class conversations in this one. I've already said to them, I'm going to sit back. I'm going to be the sponge in this episode. And I want to get straight in. So just before we start, I will mention the roles that the lads are in. They have previously done podcasts with me before, but Dan is the head performance coach at Los Angeles Football Club. And Yoeri has changed roles since last time we spoke. He's now head of strength at AFC Ajax. So we'll get straight into it. Yoeri, let's start with yourself. I wanted to just have a little discussion about some of the key attributes that you feel we should test with players and probably that are traditionally tested with players, just to start things off.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable question because it basically starts a conversation about, what should we be focusing on with our training interventions as like the, we could call it the physical development staff. For me, the guiding factor here is, of course, one, I want what we're doing is going to improve performance in sport, or at least improve the likelihood of performance in sport. Then second after that, I want to make sure that whatever assessment we're doing is that it's going to be prescriptive and it's going to be descriptive in nature. So the assessment basically has to give us an idea of where the athlete is currently or needs to go to. And then it also needs to have some kind of influence on the training intervention that's about to follow. So what we oftentimes see in practice is that we test for the sake of testing. So very simply put, we want to have as many numbers about something as we can possibly get. I mean, whether it be for the sake of validating our own existence within a staff, or trying to find reasons why someone might or might not be progressing. But if an assessment doesn't tell us anything that influences our process, by definition, to me, it is probably disposable. So if you're going to be investing your time into assessing or testing, it probably needs to be the stuff that's time tested and needs to be the stuff that's highly likely to influence your programming or your training interventions. So if you're going to look around clubs, you're probably going to find a lot of variations of jumping assessments, whether that's counter movement jumping, whether that is drop jumping or some kind of other RSI tests. Now, whatever tools we use for this could be a ton of different things. Some clubs will have, the higher budget ones will have force plates to them available, giving them far more metrics about, stuff like asymmetries, about what's happening to generate the impulse that generates the jump height, the ground contact times, all that kind of stuff. Other people might have to use a My Jump app, very cheap. Some people might use a GymAware. So there's various ways of doing this, but we can probably say most people will do some counter movement jump testing and RSI testing. Besides that, you're probably going to see something along the lines of acceleration or sprint testing, whether it's maximal sprinting or coming closer. You're probably going to see that. You're going to see some kind of strength test, whether that's through an isometric mid-thigh pull or through RM testing, something we can just definitely discuss later. I have my opinions on those too. Some will test change direction, other will test agility, also something that's highly debatable as to which is going to be more important in your training process or influencing your training process. We're probably going to have some kind of energy systems assessment. Some will try to do that highly specifically. Others might do it more generally. Some might do a watt bike test. Some might do a running test. There's various ways of looking at it. And then, of course, we're going to try to assess and monitor through practice load if we have the tools available to us. I think those are probably going to be top ones. Now, of course, if you're going to go a little bit more towards the medical side, we're going to look at range of motion assessments for joints, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's a bunch. Dan, I don't know, did I miss some? I probably did.
No, I think you're probably right on par. Maybe we add in some body compositional testing that the sports nutritionists might be doing that would benefit us as strength coaches. But other than that, I would agree with everything you just said.
And what about to break that down into a little bit more detail now? Because when we're talking about things like strength testing, for example, Dan, what would your approach be, or what have you seen maybe commonly used in terms of strength testing? Because I know we can go into RM testing. I think that'll be interesting just to get your points of view on that. But just in terms of like movements used, maybe screens used, for example, what sort of things have you seen around testing strength?
I would say from what I've done personally and what I've seen done in different clubs, you can do things such as bodyweight movements, especially for younger kids, push-ups, pull-ups, squats, that kind of stuff. I don't know if I find value in that when we all know the movement will change as you add load. Sometimes it's really difficult to get into a certain position with no load in a squat as it is. So I think that's kind of the base level of people don't even have the weights and they just want to say, can I get a strength assessment because I have no weight room? On the complete other end of the spectrum, yes, you could do some max strength testing, and Yoeri already mentioned some maybe like an isometric version of a test or an assessment there. I think one thing that I would say is pretty important is to almost use your strength program as the assessment, which we can probably get into a whole lot more later. But does there necessarily need to be a marker of an RM test for a 17-year-old athlete if they've never lifted before? Maybe that just comes 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later. And I think a theme that we should probably come back to and discuss throughout the entire talk is, are we discussing assessments that need to be done day one, or is this an assessment over 6 weeks, or is it a consistent assessment? One thing that I personally made the mistake of is I've been the guy my first year where I tested everything. We had VO2 tests. It took me 6.5 hours to get all the players done. Didn't think it would take that long, but we had the VO2 test, we did the beep test, we did a mass test, then we did all the strength tests, we did the speed test. And I didn't test again until next year, 12 months later. And so I had all this data and I could tell people, look, I'm a strength coach. I test this stuff. But when they say, how does it affect your programming? There was probably 2 things of everything I did that actually affected how I prescribe training in the future. So that's something that Yoeri kind of already alluded to as well. So I'm just saying firsthand, I've made that mistake and learned, why am I going to waste my time? And I don't need data to prove, the worth of my job. But I do think there's value in discussion of certain tests you can do. Now, it's probably varied upon the equipment you have. I mean, what would you say if you don't have any equipment? What is your go-to if you have no gym? I mean, is it just body weight tests, or what are you looking at?
I mean, without equipment, that's going to be very tough. I probably wouldn't even put value to it. I'd probably just assess, maybe even look at something like a static jump versus a counter movement jump. As like, at least I can tell whether someone's able to generate concentrically a lot of force in a short amount of time. That's going to be a little bit closer to strength than, for instance, if I did a regular counter movement jump, but I'd probably just toss it aside. Like you would do a movement screen and that'd probably be it. Yeah.
So what about this? Because I know a lot of clubs that I've talked to that are in different divisions or different stages in their process as a club. If a club comes to you and says, hey, I've got a very small budget, where am I spending my money? Maybe that's a good discussion to have as far as, do I spend it more on some of the speed continuum stuff, or do I spend it on the strength stuff? Where would you, and there's probably an argument for both, but where would you spend that money with a low budget? I'm not going to put a number on it, but if we're trying to help someone to say, I have to pick and choose because I can't have everything.
From just purely from an assessment perspective, like equipment for assessment, I feel like the good thing is there's a lot of testing equipment that's pretty cheap. Like I said, if you're looking at jump assessments, you can just use the MyJump app. I mean, I've used it for years, and it is a hassle to use in a large group because you have to look at every single video and like
Yeah.
get the jump out there and look at when their toes leave the ground and when they actually hit the ground again. Is it going to be the best measurement tool? No, because if it uses flight time to calculate, which by definition is not going to be the most accurate measurement of what the athlete is actually doing. Through movement strategy, we can basically cheat through that test. So it's not going to be ideal, but generally, I just want to hit big and try to get as many of them as close to the truth as possible for my assessments to try to have an idea of where the athletes are. So something like that, I don't remember. I believe it was $10, and it just cost me a lot of time, but it didn't cost me a lot of money. So that's one. I mean, even timing gates aren't really that expensive. It depends, how much is the budget? But for instance, for strength, I would look at like a crane scale. I mean, you're not going to need 10K force plates. You can use a crane scale and you're going to get close. Now, it's going to tell you much less than the force plates will. But again, just like the MyJump app won't be as accurate, as valid as the force plates, it's probably going to tell you a lot to influence your training process. And it's going to be the same for something like a crane scale. So I don't think we need all these fancy tools. Now, I'm not going to lie, it makes my job a lot easier. But they're not a total necessity to have, in my opinion.
Is the one method or test that you guys like would prioritize? So what I'm trying to get at is, you mentioned the tests that are used in terms of speed testing, in terms of looking at strength work, and you can approach those in all different ways. But is there maybe one or two that you'd look at and think, actually, these are the ones I'm leaning more towards? Or does it depend on each individual case? For example, if a player needs to work on strength, you're going to look more on that. If you know what I mean, like, are there some priorities?
I do believe so. I think now this might ruffle some feathers, but not everyone, even in elite sports, is going to have enough staff to fully individualize everyone's programs and actually let it be more efficient and effective than if they were to work in a group. And we all want to say everyone is a unique little butterfly and everyone needs something specifically catered to them. And to a large extent, yes, that's true. But you also need to have the staff and the quality of staff to be able to manifest all that and make sure that it actually helps them. Because if you're alone and you got 20 dudes in the same time in the gym, and they're all 20 and 30 years old and they all don't really give a crap about the gym, let's be honest, is giving all of them their individual programs really going to be better than if you structure the gym to the point where you can help each and every single one individual because you're using one selected lift or exercise or modality or whatever. Now, I'm not saying that group is better than individual at all, but what likely is going to be a little bit more quote unquote ideal is going to be some kind of grouping of athletes, right? We have a very large group, and let's say I just use a cookie cutter approach and I say, all right, let's get all these guys stronger. What's going to happen? It's going to end up 3 different groups. One is going to be the non-adapters, one is going to be the adapters, and one is just the ones that are just going to stay where they are. Now, I don't want my program to be successful for a third of my team. I want to be as close to hitting the truth, right? So what they actually need as possible. The assessments can help me group some of these players into buckets. For instance, the ones that are strength deficient, some that might be a little bit more elastic deficient, or the ability to utilize elastic energy, and others might be a little bit more, let's say, ballistic deficient. So one would be showing up in an RSI test or in a sprint test. Another might show up in a counter movement jump test. Another might show up in like a strength test, right? Where they are so far away from the mean that we can say, all right, this might limit or inhibit their ability to perform in the game of football. So we target that a little bit more, right? So I can divide my group into smaller groups based on the assessments that I do. Now, for me personally, then I would look at speed, I would look at power, and I would look at strength. Whichever 3 assessments you use for that, or whatever combination of assessments, that's debatable. But I feel like those 3 are going to influence how you fill in the physical development training. Of course, understanding that energy systems testing is also there on the side. Now, I could make this more complicated and say, I need a movement screen, I need this and that, all that kind of stuff. But I feel if I just talk about enhancing performance or not necessarily decreasing risk of injury, which is another case in and of itself, I feel like speed, strength, power, having a test for all three to see where are the athletes deficient in regards to the rest of the group or position specific or the level that they're vying to play at. And from them, they're allowing that to drive how I write the training interventions for those athletes.
Do you have anything to add to that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking through that in the groups, we definitely know these buckets of players, and you even mentioned the ones that they're just going to the gym because they have to. You know, that is a portion of the team, and you're hoping at some point they will engage, not just buy in, but really engage in the process a little more. But if they're not, you're telling them, hey, can we check off some things? Because according to the assessment, which maybe you didn't even give 100% effort on, you just jumped because you're like, I got to jump real quick and warm up. And I said, did you hit the bike? Did you stretch? Nope. Okay, a 2-minute jump. And then even on our force plates, you know, what's that data look like? So that's a whole piece there. Something I want to add on about the energy system development side, and this is just how in my own career, how I've gone back and forth. Sometimes we get these new athletes, these young athletes, and maybe they've never done a yo-yo test in their life. And so they don't have the experience where they can, you know, it's still, I think testing still a skill. They can somewhat navigate that a bit. Whereas we have a bunch of our guys who have been with us for a while and in different settings where they might be doing a yo-yo test 6 times in an off season, you know, at a certain progression. And so once they get there, maybe anxiety's down, maybe they understand, you know, what they're going to push. Maybe they've learned the test and so they skip one on purpose because they can miss that one. You know, these athletes, they start to learn the tricks. And part of me, what thinks where I go with my mind about the ESD stuff is, you know, do we even need to test every single athlete? Training is going to expose a bunch of guys. Like offline, Yoeri, we talked about, like, just look at the heart rate response. If you have a heart rate monitor of a guy doing an 8v8, and of course there's different positional demands, but if they're spending, you know, 20-30% of their, you know, 90% max heart rate in that drill, and there's some guys that are just chilling, is it because the drill's, you know, the way the drill is, or are they truly like, hey, I just played 5v5 small side with my buddies all off season long, you know, and what is that there? So I think an assessment that needs to be discussed is almost an intake where Yoeri and Ben, we sit down with the guy before we do anything and just say, how was your off season? Or because we know what they went, because it's all over social media. Hey, it looked like it was fun. How was your training consistency when you were traveling the world? And we kind of know the options they had. Maybe they're not as fit as they could be. Not that we all think they need to be at max fitness day one of preseason, but I think that can come back and guide the assessments. Because like you're saying, can we find a bucket that you might be deficient in this moment of time and then put them into that bucket? When it comes to ESD stuff, I'm just not fully convinced that we need to fully do that. And maybe it's more specific to a certain group and saying, hey, over the past few seasons, we've noticed this about you. And so we'd like to test this. And something else you mentioned, you was saying, hey, sometimes you don't have the staff to carry out all these tests. And what I've done in the past is I've said, hey, there's 6 guys here, and only you 6 are going to do this one assessment because we think it's valuable. We talk through about why are you doing it? Because we don't want to get the whole, that's not fair that I have to do this. And if you can build that culture in those discussions where you're saying, all I'm trying to do is give you more individualization, you little butterfly, right? We want you to be able to spread your wings, and this is all for you, but this is why you're doing this. Maybe, you know, last year you weren't a starter. You weren't even in the 18 or the 20, right? You're a fringe player trying to break in. This is what's going to be best for you. Or if you're in that 12 to 20 now, you're not getting a lot of minutes, but there could be a time with an injury or you play well and you pop right into a 90-minute match. How can we start to close that gap? What assessments can I do that'll best give me the evaluation of where you're at there to push forward? And sorry, sidetracking, that's just a thought I had with the ESD stuff. And if you have GPS and you have heart rate, I know Yoeri's laughing because he knows exactly what we go through all the time. So sorry, that's where my brain's going with that.
It's, you know, I think there's 2 things that I think is really interesting there. I think one, like you said, if you gather data from practice, sport practice and games, that's going to tell you a lot about your ESD. And especially, like you said, you know, stuff like heart rate recovery, especially if you put that next to like the intensities and the actual load that the athlete went through. And you see that, for instance, the load relative to other players is low and their time that they spend at top heart rate is actually very high. then that of course tells you a lot. So, I mean, generally, if you're going to be, if players come back in, most performance staff are going to have to do some kind of, might even call it arbitrary ESD test, because that's also what sport coaches or basically expect of them. But I feel like in most sports, the most efficient way and effective way to target ESD development or ESD is through sport practice and actual designing of drills to make sure that we're targeting some of these physical qualities. Because I understand, especially if players are better than the level that they compete at, technically and tactically, what's going to happen? They're not going to have to basically load the physical aspect because they're just so much better, right? You don't have to run the distance. You're not going to get into these high heart rate zones because you're just so much better. And we do want to prepare the athletes for the situation in which they are going to have to work harder because they don't dominate through technical and tactical. But we can do that through properly designing drills in sport, which is always going to be more specific towards the game match demands than, let's say, putting them on the bike because we feel like they were deficient in a yo-yo test. So I think that's definitely a good point. I feel like, if you don't get the data from sport practice, then maybe there's more of a need to do a general assessment. But if I can get the data through sport and matches, that's a win to me. Then secondly, like you already said about some of your guys with the assessments, it's a skill. Everything we basically do to a certain extent can be considered a skill. And that's, for instance, going back to your point that you guys were discussing earlier about the strength testing. I don't like RM testing for the reason, are we truly increasing strength output, or are the players just getting better at said skill? For instance, a squat, trap bar, deadlift, regular deadlift, whatever it may be, right? If the training tool that we use, the training intervention, is the same as the assessment, then yes, highly likely we're going to see some kind of improvement during the assessment. Otherwise, I don't know what you're doing. Like if you're squatting and you use the squat as the assessment and the squat cells going up, like there's probably something wrong. But it makes sense, right? We test the squat, we train the squat, we retest the squat. Do we get better at it? Yes, likely. Does that mean that these athletes actually got stronger or just better at the skill of squatting? Now, I want to take that doubt away. So that's, for instance, why I personally prefer the isometric mid-thigh pull, because let's say my training intervention is a squat, which to a certain extent is going to be relatively non-specific to the isometric mid-thigh pull for the fact that the maximum effort that we have to give is in the bottom position of the squat, right? When it's actually the least favorable joint positions. And at this isometric mid-thigh pull, it's actually where in the squat you would be decelerating the bar because otherwise you'd turn into a ballistic object with a heavy bar on your back, which probably isn't going to be the best idea, right? So there's already some kind of disconnect between the squat and between isometric mid-thigh pull. Now, if I've been training the squat and then I retest the isometric mid-thigh pull and the mid-thigh pull goes up without me doing or using the isometric mid-thigh pull in between, and there's not really much of a skill component, at least far less than a squat or a deadlift, and they still get better, then I can reasonably, logically state that my athletes got quote unquote stronger. Now, as Dan already alluded to earlier, we can get all our data for whether they got better in squatting through making sure we logging our working sets, right? If we just look at the load that they're getting done in training, same as we would on the field, we can see whether they're getting stronger. Don't even have to max out for that. We can use formulas, for instance, Epley's formula to calculate a guesstimated 1RM. And in the meantime, we can use the isometric mid-thigh pull to kind of assess whether that increased strength in that specific skill or a multitude of skills, different lifts, actually transfers to another strength assessment, which to me is going to be far more valuable because I do not really see football players squatting heavy barbells on the pitch. So I want to see transfer of strength, not necessarily increased skill in one given movement.
Some great points in there, because I think some of it as well comes down to intent in testing, isn't it? It's the skill, but then it's also the intent. And it's like, you'd have seen it before when people are either going through strength tests or maybe even speed test is the one as well. Like, are we maximally sprinting or are we running quick? Like, there's a difference, isn't there? And it's learning that intent that they have to put into that. And like you're saying, with the skill of squatting or the skill of lifting something heavy and getting in the technical side, there's a lot more to it, isn't there, than just testing every now and again. So no, it's really interesting, those points that you've made, and I fully agree with them. And then there's also the other side, which you mentioned before, about the culture, if you want to call it that, of why we're actually doing the tests at those times. Is it controlled by the practitioner alone? Probably not. Or is it coming from other sources that they want that to be done? And I know it's certainly the case in the UK, and probably I could be speaking out of line, but more than likely in academies where certain boxes have to be ticked at certain times. So I know there's more of a battle to it than just what tests do we do? Do we do any tests? Can we get it from practice? But it's certainly an interesting aspect of it, of how much attention we pay to it, isn't it? And then we're going to talk in a little bit as well on how it informs practice as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Dan, I didn't even get to that point, like you said, about athletes not really giving a crap about the test in of itself. I mean, the amount of times where I've had, players come up to me and I was like, hey, did you just do the jump test? And they were like, yeah, I jumped like 60%. And I'm like, oh, Lord. Sometimes we fall into this massive trap, right? I'm sure you see the same, Dan. It's like, we think as practitioners, we're like, oh, we care so much about these numbers, again, because it maybe even, quote unquote, validates our existence, that we also assume that other people care. But to be fair, a lot of sport coaches don't care. And the extent to which the players care is even less. So you got to understand, if you're going to use a certain test and you need high intent to drive a true value that's going to influence your training process, then maybe doing it less frequently, or being a little bit more clever in what you let them test instead of just giving them the entire test battery, is going to help with getting the athletes to give that intent.
And I'll go back to something you said. The first thing you said when you talked about assessment, because I wrote it down, was number one, does it improve performance? That's all that, the coaching staff and the players, that's all they care about. So we talk about the rule of thirds. The third that is just coming in to tick the box, if I have to do this, if they see that they start playing better on the field, typically they're not going to be like, oh, Yoeri, that was all because of you. But maybe they'll say there's something in the weight room or in this performance plan we're doing that's going to improve that. So number one, does it improve performance? If we can do that, and like you said, I think that'll drive intent. We do various phases like we all do, right? We try and build implied metrics in the weight room to elicit some sort of response. And I just noticed, like, guys doing box jumps, we're trying to control that eccentric load on them, but they're not really trying at all. And then I saw in the corner of my eye, we have a garage that rolls up, and one guy just like, oh, I bet you can't touch that. And they were jumping so hard to touch it. And I looked at my strength coach and I was like, we should set the garage to a certain height and just tell them, hey, you got to try 3 times, right? Every set or something like that. And sure enough, there was a good amount of guys in the force plate. The numbers went up the next, it's like, there's a lot of things that you could say could have improved that, but it was one thing that we changed. And we just thought some things that are fun, where they're not going to think like, oh, I need to jump as hard as I can, but their body's going to tell them, if I want to touch this thing, I have to do that. Maybe we got to change assessments that aren't so rigid. And it's not, how do you measure that? Well, you just, you could measure the distance and see how high they're touching, but they're watching these NBA players dunk, praising the games. They're watching Yoeri's Instagram, him dunk over people. And so then they want to get in there and see, how can I go touch this garage gym? So yeah, maybe the assessments can be fluid. Like you said, is a squat exactly the same movement as ice bench, mid thigh pull? No, there's probably some similarities at a little point, but not really. But if that improves the other one, we know we're going in the right direction. We actually have a belt squat, which we were fortunate to get through some means, but that's something where guys aren't even touching the bar now, right? We just load that up under the force play and we just tell them, just try and stand up as hard as you can at this joint angle. And most guys are like, okay, that's pretty easy, except it's kind of like the awkward, where do I put my hands during the interview? So we've got to coach that a little bit. But other than that, they got a good hang of it. So no, number one, like you said, improve performance. I think if it does that, then the coaching staff says, okay, I'm on board with this. And the players will say, yeah, let's do a little bit more. That was huge.
I suppose it's taking them out of that testing mindset, isn't it? When you're going into like a test, or like, if you think about when players have done like a bleep test or something like that, everyone's in that state of, oh, we're being tested. You're being tested every single day in training, but this day is the important one. So I suppose like that's what you're saying about the jumping. It completely takes them out of that mindset, and they just then become the competitors that they are, aren't they? Like that
It
they are
made
all
me
the
think,
time.
like, do I need to get a basketball hoop in the gym, which I know some clubs have, but do you get that something that's adjustable? And as I know it's not like for our sport at football, but I'm like, okay, maybe there's something where we said we have a dunking phase where we're gonna set the hoop at 8 feet because not a lot of our guys can even palm a ball, but you're gonna dunk this basketball or volleyball or something, and maybe that's part of the phase in the weight room, and they just have fun, and we say, okay, you got to progressively overload this movement, but then you can get to go and jump and try and dunk. I don't know. Maybe that's something that people should start thinking outside of the box a little bit more. It's just something that seems like the guys would have fun, and that's really get the intent.
Well, for sure. And I think personally, from my own experiences, I feel like high intent drives most of the adaptations. It requires some kind of, oftentimes it requires a player not necessarily to be knowledgeable, but to have high intent and have a good feeling for what they're doing. So they're not just going through the motions, right? So I feel like if we're going to do some kind of training intervention and you're basically turning on that mode by making it more competitive or making it more fun, then I'm all for that, because biggest thing in training is having that consistent intent over time, right? If we can get that done, whatever means, we're probably going to be doing a good job. Now, if we just hit the big rocks and we're using various tools to make it more engaging, that's all good. Now, of course, the training or the assessments, we want it to be valid. We want it to be reliable. So we need a large amount of standardization. Like we couldn't say, all right, if do like the best trick dunk, and that's going to be your assessment for your jumping capabilities, because there's very little standardization. But we can use something like jumping towards a target or onto a target that drives competitiveness and high intent that might enhance the adaptation that we want to see subsequently for the assessment. So I feel like that's definitely a big key. And we definitely also try to use competitiveness as much as we can to drive the intent for the assessments. So I'm definitely not scared of putting their numbers up in the weight room and showing them, because they start to make fun of each other. And when I pull out the force plates, which, for instance, if I embed testing into my program, then it's not seen as like this separate entity, and it's just like, all right, we're prepping for practice today. There's the force plates. And once the laptop is out, I already have like 3 or 4 dudes next to me, like, Yoeri, can I jump today? Can I jump today? I'm like, well, of course you can jump today. And when jumping, I generally will have 3 and 4 of those other dudes standing behind me, like, how much do you have?
Yeah.
So like me looking at all the metrics, and then for instance, we're looking at jump height, and then one of the other players will be like, yeah, but he jumped slower. He looks at the other metrics.
Oh, that's great. They're learning.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll be telling them like, yeah, you're jumping well, but I want to see a little bit more speed during the time that you spend on the ground, right? Because consider like, if you're on the field, you don't have all the time in the world. So we're not just looking at jump height outputs. We're also looking at the time needed to generate that height. So then, I'm sitting with the laptop. You got one of the players like, yeah, but he's slow. So, that kind of competitiveness definitely drives intent. So I wholeheartedly agree. I think that's a big key also for the assessments.
What about another area that we mentioned before in terms of speed testing? So I'm intrigued to get your thoughts on this as well, because when we spoke about sort of power, strength, and creating that intent, speed is another one, isn't it? Where we need players to be going at it to get some true values. What's your thoughts on it? Like, essentially, are there alternatives to literally just running speed gates where you feel like we can get a bit more that's going to maybe inform what we do in practice a little bit more?
I feel like a sprinting with timing gates is kind of like the standing counter move and jump, especially with no arms. Again, we use it because it's easier to standardize. It's relatively general, right? Players will even say that, like, yeah, but I don't really run in a straight line. Yeah, I don't really run for that long, or I don't jump with my hands on my hips. And I can't even, they're not even wrong. But for the sake of standardization, it's probably, quote unquote, a must, right? Now, are there different ways to assess these also for sprinting? Yeah, probably. Again, just like Dan alluded to earlier, if we're looking at practice data and game data, we can already get a pretty good estimation for it, because let's be honest, there are going to be situations in clubs where your sport coach might not even allow you to do a separate sprint test because they might be scared of hamstring tears, or even the players being scared of hamstring tests. Because if they're sprinting on the field during an 11 on 11 drill, or they're sprinting on the field during the match, they don't think about anything, right? They're just going. They see a ball, or they just see a defender or an offender, and they just react. They're not thinking about anything. But when they set up with the timing gates and 3 sports scientists next to them, it changes. They tend to tighten up. Maybe even their mechanics changes. Maybe they even hold back because they're afraid of the consequences of it. Even, they constantly sprint, and there's not really any higher inherent risk than what they're already doing. And if they've been prepared properly, it's not going to be an issue. It can still play in their mind or in the coach's mind. So if that's the case, you could look at putting the timing gates on the field and incorporating them into drills, maybe where you're doing more of a flying 10, for instance. Of course, in those situations where maybe you're involving different aspects or facets or different tools to kind of get their mind off of things, it's a possibility. Now, whatever you're going to use, I'm not really going to go into that right now, but it could take away from the standardization, but it could still tell you a lot. Or you just look at the game data, you look at the GPS data, and you look at top end speeds reached. But then you could also say, for a defender, if he hits very high speeds reached, maybe that just means that he was dumb and out of position. Yeah. So the ones that are actually very smart don't hit the high speeds because they don't have to get there. Yeah. So you do want to have some kind of speed assessment, ideally, and preferably one that is reliable and valid, that is standardized, all that good stuff. But if not, which are just situations you might come across, then there are variations and options that you could possibly use, in my opinion.
What do you think on that, Dan?
Yeah, I would agree. I think you listed so many, the politics of sport that you have to work around. Do clubs want to invest in the money for that? Is the coaching staff comfortable? And fairness to them, there may have been a club they were at where they had a bunch of hamstring injuries when they saw it, or their best player got injured doing a test on day one, and they were like, I don't want to make that mistake again. And I have no judgments for that, because that was their experience. And what are you going to say? But I do think you talked about some workarounds with the GPS. I do think you can look at top end speed. And, people probably ask us all the time, oh, what's the fastest game speed you see? And I'll usually say, actually, the fastest speed is training, because we've done the standardized test where we're saying you're going to do your zone 6 or that high speed running, the highest velocity you can get there. I do think there's things like you're saying, just like in the weight room, can we make it standardized, but also this is just part of training. So we're going to do a 9-yard acceleration. We're going to do 4 sets of them. And you're going to have X amount of rest, because I'm going to have you all walk back and take the time. You can chit chat. But when it's your time to go, you have to push. And then we can show them on the GPS after and say, hey, out of the 6 accelerations we did, you actually hit this, this band, the top band, band 3. Or like you said, put it up in the weight room and list it out and say, okay, Daniel, you only got 2 out of the 4, and you got 4 to 4, and Ben, you got 4 to 4. Okay, well, was I slacking off? Or the truth is, I'm just not a very good accelerator. Is that something I need to be working on? And so then there's some different discussions there where guys can come in, and again, we can use an assessment to be valuable to the training we use. So now I might say, hey, you're a pretty strong guy, but I actually want you doing some sled work because we want you to be in that acceleration movement a little bit longer. And so we're going to lightly load you, or, we have different ways that we can do that, right? So I think the GPS can be a good workaround. I 100% agree with the fact that in most of these speed tests, guys tense up, or maybe they're really overshooting. Maybe they're not prepared to do it, and they're going to hit a new max speed. And by them going 110%, and they hit a new max to acceleration, whatever it is, that's going to put them in a worse spot, or maybe at a risk for some inherent injury, which we don't want. So I think there's things that we can figure out as practitioners around the discussion of how do we make this standardized, but still something where the guys can almost bring down the anxiety about it, is kind of what I'm thinking. Yes, if there's a drill that the coaches do for finishing, and it's the same drill every time, and we feel like we can get it, maybe that's the way to do it. But I agree, if you put up the force plates once a month, every time they see that, they're going to get all tight before they jump. If you put up the speed, the lasers or timing aids, whatever you're using once a month, I think comes back to the fact of, how can we get that involved? And I know we're talking about speed, but let me just really give a quick reference to the NordBord or some sort of Nordic hamstring test. Well, what I've had the most success with there was someone, a lot of athletes are really terrified of the Nordic exercise in general. We just did it every single week. We put the NordBord out every single week and was like, this is just part of training. We'll ban them or we'll find a way to unload them. But eventually these guys can get to a place where they're loading their Nordics and they're not afraid of it. And they'll do it 2 days before a game. That's not like, coach, 2 days before, or it's coach 2 days after a game. I'm like, there's never a perfect time to do it, but we got to find a way to get some sort of load that way. So Yoeri, I think you're right on. Can you make it just a part of training? It's not like this big assessment day. That's just training for the day. We're training speed, and you're going to get run up to the line. You're going to give me a 85%, 90, and then somewhere between 95 and 100. And let's just use that as a training tool. I think that's the discussion to have.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like what you're saying with the NordBord, and kind of then the same with, for instance, the timing gates on the field, it's kind of like a stress inoculation, right? We're just putting it there and we're slowly just incorporating them instead of just saying, okay, boom, here's 3 times a year where you're doing this and you have no experience with it. And it just looks, maybe it looks scary to them. So for me, it's been the same way, because dudes would be like, oh, the NordBord, that's so scary. And especially because one of them will cramp up and then all the others are going to be like, see, he tore his hamstring. I'm like, no, that's a cramp.
Yeah, you'll be okay.
Yeah, but once you do it frequently and they see the results and they see that nothing ever goes wrong with it, then they're going to be like, oh, yeah, it's fine. Now, of course, if they have some kind of some notion or idea beforehand of why they think it's bad, just like, for instance, like you said about the coaching staff with the sprinting and having some kind of experience in the past, if during testing something does go wrong, you're really losing them. So you have to make sure that especially the ones that are a little bit more susceptible to having second thoughts about some of the assessments, is that you really, really use that stress inoculation. So just step by step, introducing them to it, explain them why it's safe, showing them through having other players do it, all that kind of stuff, to the point where hopefully everyone does the assessment. And again, just like we mentioned earlier, with high intent.
Let me ask this real quick, Yoeri, because it's something that I go back and forth on, and this is like not the science part of it all, but how often will you do the assessment before they do it? Almost as like a, look, guys, I jumped in the water and it's okay. Now, I know like a guy like you jumping on the force plate is probably more impressive to them. So like, come on, but are you cool with it? Are you finding times where you'll do the assessment yourself and say, okay, here's what we're doing, but you'll actually demonstrate, a sub-max or a max effort? But I do think that's an important thing.
Yeah, no, for sure. I try to do every assessment because it gets me a better idea of what it feels like and what they might experience. Now, it's only my anecdotal evidence, so what someone else might experience is totally different. For instance, NordBord, I've seen guys with especially posterior knee issues in the past that really dislike the NordBord. So, then we'll find another way. Maybe, for instance, you do something with the force plates and kind of a hip extension assessment for the hamstrings.
Yeah.
I don't have that experience because I have been very fortunate with my knees besides patellar tendinopathy. So I can't get that through doing NordBords, but I can do it myself. For instance, what I would do is I would do more than the protocol prescribes for us, and then see what my response is the day after or the day after that, right? Go through the exact same training session as them, and then seeing, okay, what happens with my body? Now, taking into consideration, I did not have sport practice, right? Because if I'm already experiencing fatigue and I don't even have the other stressors, then they're probably going to have that. So I feel like playing around with it definitely helps you be more engaged into what the athletes might experience. And then from my perspective, I try to do as much in front of them as possible because it drives high intent. So, I mean, if you have the jump record, then everyone's going to try to gun at you. So that's always the fun part. So I'll write down a list and I'll just write my own name, like, just make sure, like, yeah, y'all know.
Yeah, for sure.
So then when that happens, it drives competitiveness, and that's fun. And I feel like that's definitely valuable. Yeah, for sure.
And I want to jump in one more thing, because I'm sure we've sat in the staff meetings before, and at least the staffs that I've been a part of, it's kind of like everyone goes. If you're a physiotherapist, if you're a massage therapist, I don't judge. And if you have an idea and it could help us get somewhere else, let's do it. But sometimes you have the, oh yeah, they should be able to do a 10 or 11 minute yo-yo IR too easy. And in the most humble way, I'll just be like, have you done one of those recently? Going from 0 to an 11-minute, that could be pretty difficult for some people. And just kind of asking that question, because the athletes will ask that question. You have the guys where it's like, well, did you do this? Do you know what it feels like? Like when I first started, 10 years ago as an intern, I remember thinking to myself, if I want to work with NFL guys, I need to get as close to a 300-pound squat as I can, minimum. So I know what that feels like. Like, is my form going to be perfect? And, or like, what am I going to feel at the bottom of the squat? And so that's what my goal was. How can I do a lot of these max strength tests? And that way, when the question does come up, have you done this? You can say, actually, yeah, I know how it feels. And I can get, on that test, I can give you some leeway. Or I might be like, you know what, I'm not going to have these guys do this, especially after a -3 session where it's their heaviest session of the day. It's mid-season. It's probably not the time to do it. So maybe this is just more PSA from you and I to say, any practitioner, do all the tests that you're going to tell someone else to do. Do it more than once. Don't just do it the day before the assessment. Really go through it a lot. And then maybe that way it's not the athlete, the person to test it out, but it's you yourself. And that way you can say, okay, this is approved by us and we figured it out. So I think that's valuable.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to be fair, like if I were to give young practitioners advice about that kind of stuff, I would definitely say, get your skin in the game. Is it a necessity for you to get on their level? No, not at all. Like, you don't have to jump as high as them, squat more weight than them, all that kind of stuff. But you do have to have some kind of experience in how that stuff feels, and how trying to get stronger feels, and how trying to jump higher feels, and how doing something like a Nordboard, what that feels like. Because if you've experienced a cramp in a Nordboard and you see one of the players, he goes down very slowly and then you just collapse, he's like, ah! And then you can say, yeah, nice little cramp, huh? I've had that last week. And he's like, oh, really? Oh, yeah, okay. So I feel like it helps. I mean, again, it's just anecdotal evidence. It is not the most important thing, but globally, it can help you understand and engage with your athletes better. And that is going to have them trust you more. And if they trust you better, they're going to give you intent when you ask them or prescribe high intent stuff. So I feel like you just hit the nail right on the head. Maybe it's a PSA, maybe not, maybe it's unwanted. Sorry, Ben. But that is, I feel the same way. That's just super important. Get your skin in the game, please, please, please.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great point. I think a lot of this as well is coming down to the psychological state you're trying to get your players in as well at that time, isn't it? Because like we're saying, tapping into that competitive edge of our players, whether that is against you or whether it's how we set up certain challenges and drills, and just taking them away from that. I know things have got to be structured in terms of testing, but it's getting them out of that mindset of it's testing day, it's testing time. Now you've got to do the sprint. And that's what we're talking about, isn't it? A lot of it does come down to the psychology as much as physically what is going on with the player, because we see that every day anyway.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. What about in terms of, we touched on it a little bit before, how data should be used? Because I think Dan mentioned before, we probably all had experiences as testing and coming out with sets of data where we're like, right, that's great. We've got all our data. This is what our players are up to right now. But then where do we go from there? Like, when are we testing again? How do we make it impactful? And how do we have that real impact on the pitch for our players?
Dan, you gonna rush?
Yeah, let me jump in here, because obviously I was the one that has made that huge mistake. And don't send me back there. That was hours and hours of punching numbers back in the early Excel days. I'm just like, what am I doing with my life? I think number one, so I read this really good book a couple years ago by, I'm going to butcher last name, but John Doerr called Measure What Matters. And it's a great book. It's more in the tech world. And that's pretty much like a bunch of examples of that, of what is going to actually be important to your business, your programming, your training. And then you should probably measure those things more often and see those things, or what are the things that are important to the head decision maker, and you're going to say, okay, this is probably something I should measure there. So measure what matters. I will say, just as one little caveat, is that sometimes you're in situations where there's a manager and you see others from the world. Sometimes there's a manager that's like, hey, I don't like this and we're not going to do any of this, or that's not valuable to me. Or maybe they say GPS isn't valuable. And it's not that you're trying to outweight the manager, but maybe you're to say, you know what, for our purposes in rehab, this might be valuable. So we're gonna monitor everyone, even though the coach didn't look at it all. I think there are situations where the data may not be usable in conversation to affect training, but it might be important over the years to have that, just in case something happens, there's a change. You say, actually, we have been measuring this player for the past 2 years, and here's what some norms are. So there probably is an argument to some point where you can collect data where it might just seem to collect, but there is a long-term goal at the end. I would say beyond that, Yoeri's already mentioned, sometimes there's not even a staff to be able to do all these different assessments. It might be you and 20 players. And if that's the case, you have to choose the assessments that you can run efficiently and that you can have the time to go through the data, understand what that is. So let me just give a quick example. Something on the lower end, if there's a club that doesn't have access to GPS or that kind of stuff, RPEs might be your best solution. It might be the best assessment of training because you can just literally ask the athlete subjectively, how hard was that on this day? And if you can work that into behaviors and tell them this is not going to influence if you start or how many minutes you play, we literally just want to know, was the easiest session of the week actually really difficult for you? So we can figure out what's going on. There's different scenarios that there might come up, but stuff like that, where I would say an RPE will influence my training because I'll know if guys are giving me really high level exertions day after day, and I know that it's actually an underloading phase where we're trying to get the guys to recover a little bit more. Maybe there's a conversation to be had. And although I don't have GPS or any type of assessment on the field, that's one thing I can take away. So that's just an example of that. But I think the conversation has to be around what are you using on a daily or weekly basis and not just a month to month that can be valuable. With the exception of maybe, like Yoeri mentioned, some sort of isometric test. Maybe you're not doing that every week. Maybe you're doing it once a phase. But what are you using most often that's going to help influence training and help see, okay, I put this guy into he's ballistically deficient. That's the bucket I put him into. Is there something that I can do to assess that over 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks to see, are they getting better at that, or are they getting worse, or are they staying the same?
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. Again, it just comes down to what are we testing and how does that influence our processes? And I mean, if I feel like it's definitely a possibility to fall into the trap into thinking the truth. I think we can only try to get as close to truth as possible. So, and by the truth, I mean as efficiently and effectively organized training process as we can find. We're trying to get closer, right? And the assessments help us do that. So if I utilize a set of assessments, which I think is going to influence my training process, so they generate some kind of training intervention, like Dan said, we might have some athletes let's keep it simple. We have one group that's elastic deficient, so we're going to give them more short coupling plyometrics. We've got one that's a little bit more ballistic deficient, so we're going to give them long coupling. So let's say we see that from the counter movement jump, and then we got one strength deficient group. So we've tested that, and now that's going to drive our training intervention. We're going to give a different training intervention to those three groups. But if we don't reassess with these standardized tests that we use before the training intervention, then how the heck are we going to know that the training intervention actually created any kind of desirable adaptation? Because again, why are we subgrouping our large group is to enhance the chance that we have adapters and not non-adapters, or the ones that just stagnate, right? That's basically the goal. So if we're gonna have the assessment and if we're gonna intervene, then we have to reassess. Now, like Dan said, some assessments might be very fast. We might want to do it as often as possible, and other ones, especially ones that are a little bit more impactful, or maybe the assessments that influence training interventions that need more time to generate an adaptation, maybe we do those more periodically, every couple months, every couple weeks, maybe even twice a year, right? It depends on the assessment. For instance, if you're using the NOR board to kind of screen for risk of injury, you're probably going to want to do that a little bit more frequently. Do you want to do an isometric thigh pull every week? No, because we know it's probably not going to have an adaptation that's so quick that in a week, someone's going to generate 300 more newtons in peak vertical force. Probably not going to happen, right? So we're going to do that less frequently. So we definitely just have to look at, first and foremost, the assessments, prescriptive, descriptive, influence our training process and tell us something likely about whether we're increasing performance in sport. And then we have to reassess to see whether we're doing our job. And again, that doesn't come easy because there's a lot of factors that could influence whether someone is driving an adaptation or adapting or not, right? Lifestyle factors, what are they doing on the field? So many different things. But at least we can get closer to maybe knowing the truth than if we would not utilize the assessments pre and post training intervention.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And one last thing on the interventions we're talking about. You mentioned the MyJump earlier on. I used that in a situation before. It was a great assessment until I had to analyze all the data. And then I just thought, okay, I don't know if I have the time to get through all this before I have to get to the next thing. So, and that was my mistake of not organizing that I needed help with that. So sometimes you have a great assessment, but the process to analyze the data is going to be way longer than what you have the staff for. If I have someone that can code in R and give me all this data real quick, then I'm going to do different stuff. But I think that's something that I'm pretty vocal about what do we do with the data? Well, do you have the right structures to accept the data and spit it out the way that you want? Because if you don't, then maybe that's not the right assessment for you. If you are somehow getting force plate readings just straight to your computer with no software to tell you what's going on, you just see numbers and numbers and numbers, maybe the force plates are not the right investment. But if you do have the companies out there that can spit out and say your eccentric duration was here or your peak vertical force was here, RSI mod this, we can start having different discussions.
Yeah, I suppose that the complete other side of that is when practitioners are in a position where they have no cash, they've got no equipment. That advice is perfect, isn't it? Because then we're stripping it back to bare bones. We're saying, right, you can, obviously money comes into it, but we're looking at what can you do? What is going to be most impactful with you not having anything right now? And then growing it from there. And there's going to be quite a few people in a similar-ish position. People might have some stuff. But I think it's great advice for practitioners as a whole to say, like, keep in mind, we've got to make this impactful in terms of what we're doing. And like Dan said, staff size and people that are available come into it massively, don't it? Because there's going to be a lot of people again listening that are one of a team. There's other people listening that are the team. That there's that individual and that is them. So it completely depends, doesn't it?
For sure.
Lads, I'm going to put you on the spot because it's getting past my bedtime, for one. And also, we can't have a podcast and call it the Soccer Combine without coming up with a bit of a combine test. So if we were going to go into fantasy land and we were going to take a squad of players, not the squads that you're working with now, but we've got a squad of players and we have to set a combine style day for our team. I'm going to put you both on the spot and I'm going to get some tests from you because it wouldn't be right that we didn't. So who wants to go first?
All right. So
Yoeri. He's in. He's been thinking about this. He's been thinking about it.
To be fair, I'm going the Dan route here a little bit here too, because I'm going to use it as fun. And I'm not going to actually use that standardized test. I'm going to make this fun.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
The first thing I want to do is I want to replicate the NFL Combine, and I want the exact same outfits that NFL players walk in, and I want football dudes to wear the same outfits. Because
yes.
It's hilarious. All right. So that's how we start off with. I want the real tight tights. All right. Tights.
Yep.
That's, I feel like the best way to assess.
You have to.
Yep. Absolutely. So that's one. Then two, I mean, we could go for a hands-on hips, standing vertical jump on a force plate, but nobody's really going to care. So what we're going to do is we're going to design a vertex, and that vertex is going to have a football hanging there, and it is the dude that's going to reach for the highest header that's going to win, right? So that I feel like is one of them. I feel like number 2, right? For number 2, we're going to have to go a little bit more towards the goalie side. And that's going to be the biggest kick or throw from inside the 16. Again, drive a little bit of competitiveness. I know the goalies are definitely on the competitive side, so they're probably going to like that. So we can let them choose, see whether we're going to do a throw, kick, maybe do both. So I think those 2 are going to be the first ones that I would look at. Now, to be fair, if I look at the dudes that I've worked with so far in my career, they're all going to want to do the NFL bench press combine drill, the 225. We might have to scale it down a little bit.
Like 125.
135 exactly, and stick it there. For the strength assessment, I would actually stick with the isometric mid-thigh pull, grab some straps, right? So we're not going to get some arguments for, oh yeah, my grip, yada, yada, yada. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a massive screen that says our peak vertical force right out in front of them. You know, the boxing things that you have at like at fairs and stuff where you can just hit how hard. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to do that with the isometric mid-thigh pull, and then get a big old ding, ding, ding if they hit more than 4,000 newtons in peak force.
You might be onto something with this, by the way. That one right there. You better patent that idea, because that could be huge.
I like it.
With the recording, don't do it.
I know, right?
We're going to start a business. So start with that. Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, because dudes will everyone always compares sports. So you got to hit the 40-yard dash. We got to hit the 40-yard dash. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put them clip by clip together with NFL players. And then hopefully I'm going to have some of those real slow dudes that weigh 75 kilos, put him up against a dude 100 kilos. And if he outsprints him and he ever tells me that weights make you slower and that they shouldn't be in the weight room, I'm just going to use him that clip, even though it's not really a good argument, doesn't make sense, doesn't matter at all. I'm just going to use that clip to say, hey, buddy, next time you don't want to lift, look at that Julio Jones, right? He sprints a little bit faster than you. So that's probably going to be the meat and bones. So we're going to have the isometric mid-thigh pull, big old screen. We're going to have the throw-ins or kicks. We're going to have some headers for the vertical jump, and then we're just going to have the good old 40-yard dash. And if they want to hit the bench press, they can do the bench press. But again, with the tights on and the 135 on the bar, I don't know if that's really going to be it. So again, this is not my standardized test. This is definitely how I would do it last day of the season after Champions League, if we're just having some fun with it.
That is class.
Okay.
Dan, no pressure. No pressure, by the way. But you've got to try and beat that now.
Okay. I'm just going to think about, what do my guys ask me or challenge me to do all the time? So number 1 is a crossbar challenge from different distances, which I will say, I don't want to spiggle what we do, but this has been in a warm-up before and it was successful. But crossbar challenge at different distances, pure accuracy. Again, for the keepers, I like the distance one. I'm going to go with how hard the velocity they can get on that shot, because in my opinion, keepers are the best finishers in the league. That's all they do every single day, is just hit it upper 90 to each other and see, can I save that? So I'll go one there. I'll go with the speed shot on that one. Of course, the bench one, because every kid, no matter what age he is, says how much you bench. It's just like a standard question. How fast are you? Right? The last thing I'll probably say is, when I think about like the most reactive agility, and I know there's companies that are trying to do this, but can you put someone in a small zone with a chicken or a cat or my son, someone that's just going to be sprinting and changing direction, and can you grab them? And how long does that take? Little Midwest US Old County Fair style. That is a good measure of agility. Can you get out there in the field and just grab that sucker and bring it back? The last one that has to be in there, because it'll just tell me, mental toughness is a huge word. And obviously we all care about mental toughness, but just a simple ice bath. None of this, like just going down to your ankles. Can you go all the way head down and then pop back up, from the shoulders down, and just chill there like some US surfers do, or I guess the international surfers. So I want you to duck down, get the ice cream head, and then just chill and see, can you go 5 minutes and then get your time? So I would not personally like the last one there, but I would partake if I had to. That's all I got. Other than that, I would just say for you guys on the other side of the pond, you have to do some sort of assessment where you're flying 6 hours across your country, doing something, then
That's
flying
a
6
great
hours back.
point. Yeah.
Because whenever the Europeans come over, they're like, wow, I did not realize how big this country is. I'm like, yeah, this is like Champions League for you guys, but every single week. So yeah, that's my assessment right there. I'm glad Yoeri sparked my creativity. I'd probably rather do his than mine, to be honest. Sounds a lot more fun.
I cannot wait for Monday morning, Dan walking into the training ground with a chicken under his arm.
Hey, it's coming.
It's agility
I
time.
should get it. I need that.
To be
I gotta
honest,
find that chicken now.
to be fair, I think sun versus chicken will be the funnest one.
Yeah.
Oof, yeah.
Yeah.
My son, gosh dang. After I give him a little chocolate milk, the heat's just all over the place. So I got to remember that. No sugar for that guy.
Lads, absolutely quality. I know it was a bit of tongue-in-cheek at the end, a bit of fun, but I knew it'd be really good this episode. I absolutely loved it. I hope there's been some great value, which I'm sure there has for all the listeners. Have you got any closing thoughts just to wrap things up? Yoeri, starting with yourself.
No, I feel like I'm constantly repeating myself. Just if you're going to use assessments, make sure they influence your training process, and then afterwards revisit, see whether it drive the adaptations that you wanted to see, and just repeat that process. Make sure you're always critical of what you use and why you use it. And if you have to influence other members in your staff, you can use the data. You might have to adjust assessments from time to time, but try to stick to your core principles and you're probably going to be fine.
Dan, yourself, anything just to wrap up?
Just gratitude. I learned a lot from all you guys. I would just tell everybody else who's on social, Yoeri does a really good job on his IG, explaining stuff, making it really simple, sparking ideas. Definitely helps me out. Trying to do the same thing and encourage people to say, hey, here's how I do stuff and learn from that. So I would encourage people to go to his Instagram and check him out, or whatever other social platforms you do. I think you do a good job. So that's just gratitude and praise from me.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate that.
Incredible. And yeah, and guys, both of these guys, absolutely quality, not just in terms of this podcast, but the stuff that they both put out. So go and give them a follow. And Instagram, Daniel P. Guzman, Yoeri Pegel on Instagram as well. And then Dan, you're over on Twitter as well, aren't you? But I know you put a lot of stuff over on Instagram. But lads, I just want to say huge thank you for coming on. It's great to catch up. I absolutely loved that episode. That was quality. And yeah, Yoeri, thank you very much for staying awake and contributing. Really appreciate it. And lads, best of luck for the rest of the season.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, boys.
Thank you.
Cool.